So the project in Papua New Guinea the company was a Canadian company called Nautilus Minerals, and the project that of main concern, because actually they have licenses all through the Bismarck and Solomon Seas, so a really huge area of a very diverse sort of ecosystem, ocean ecosystem, one of the largest sort of tuna grounds in the world. And so the project that was of main concern was called Sawara 1, which is about 25 kilometres from the coast of New Ireland province, the west coast, and also close to a small lying atolls called Duke of York Islands, and also East New Britain. And Duke of York Island sat between East New Britain and East New Ireland in the Bismarck Sea. The thing is that there's never been a deep sea mine, so there's no operating deep sea mine in the world. Now, this was the first project to be given a green light, the Sawara 1 project. And our concerns were there just isn't enough information to know what the impacts are. Now, there's 3 types of deep sea mining, and this is a hydrothermal vent, so it's sort of 1,500 metres and below. And hydrothermal vents, probably of all the 3 types, so the other is across seamounts and then in the abyssal plains with manganese nodules. There is a little bit more known about the ecosystems around these hydrothermal vents, and they're very alive with incredible marine life and ecosystems. So for us, it was really clear that any sort of disturbance there was going to be quite massive. And probably a key part of that would have been the plumes, or would be the plumes that would be stirred up from what, in a sense, is like cutting these volcanoes and dredging in that ocean floor. And those plumes then would have toxicity that would move. It's really hard to understand how far they'd move, but because the ocean does move, we knew it would be very far. And then that toxicity moving up the food chain. And in that area, so close to coastal communities, it was very clear to us there would be an impact, and probably quite a severe impact. But because there really wasn't enough studies, which was a big part of our campaign around stopping it and for the communities to take on, was this lack of information around the science of the impacts, and us sort of pushing for the precautionary principle that unless we know, we can't really do this. But also, very importantly, was the issue of free, prior and informed consent. So this was the fishing grounds, traditional fishing grounds of Indigenous people who've lived there for thousands of years. And they really hadn't had the proper process of free, prior and informed consent to be able to make a decision. And there was a lot of confusion, particularly along the West Coast, because of the companies sort of coming in and out. And we were very fortunate that there's some great leadership, community leadership along that coast to really go along and inform the communities about what could happen. So it wasn't very long before communities were saying, we really don't need this and we don't want it. We're very lucky we have some partners like CSO, civil society partners in Papua New Guinea. One, namely, is the Bismarck Ramu Group. They're based in Madang, which is they're on the edge of the Bismarck Sea as well. And a small island off Madang called Kaka Island were already they were already very on this issue, because Nautilus had actually tried to open up there first. So it's on one side of the Bismarck Sea. And the community in Kaka Island and another small island to the side, Bagabag Island, those leaders came together around 2009 and really were a force to be reckoned with, and had community meetings. Professor Richard Steiner, a well-known, academic and scientist and environmentalist, went, and he spent a lot of time in Papua New Guinea and spent time with them talking about what the impacts could be. And they mobilised together and really declared, this can't happen here. So in some sense, they pushed Nautilus away from one side of the Bismarck Sea. And Nautilus, quite interestingly, chose to go to a more remote area, which is the west coast of New Ireland province, where there's no phone service there. There's not really a radio station. Maybe some parts get the local radio station. So these were communities that were much more isolated, in terms of how mining companies usually operate to try and get a social license. They sort of wielded their magic with, we'll build a road and a health clinic, which kind of didn't really serve the community in the end. I actually went to the West Coast and saw a bridge they built, which was kind of ridiculous and didn't make sense when they probably could have helped. Instead of making a fancy bridge, they could have probably helped develop the road up the West Coast. So, communities were confused and thought, this isn't on. But also having the Kaka Islanders with their movement that they were creating in their area, which included a lot of community awareness. The Kaka Islanders mobilised and walked from their island, got boats across to the mainland, and they walked all the way up to the highlands. So this was something like a 100-day walk, and it was a lot of youth. And they went into different villages and communities and did cultural performance to talk about the issues of climate change and the threat of deep sea mining. So they took it all the way from the coast to the highlands because they believed that this will impact everybody. And I think that incredible campaign that they started like 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, really sort of helped motivate communities in West Coast of New Ireland province and that part of the Bismarck Sea. And one thing that the Bismarck Grammar Group did was to be able to connect these communities so they could learn from each other. And I guess our role as sort of as campaigners outside of PNG was to provide science and as much information about the company. So then they were armed with that information to be able to take into the communities. So there's a real kind of partnership of working together. Our work has always been driven by what the communities want to do, and we provide the information or resources or whatever it is that they need to be able to build their awareness campaigns and mobilise together. So that was early on in the sort of broader campaign in Papua New Guinea. And, there's a lot of things that happened through that period around sort of Nautilus and the PNG government, and Nautilus taking the Papua New Guinean government to arbitration here in Australia because they didn't live up to the deal that they'd made, which ended up meaning that Papua New Guinea really put in quite a lot of money, like it was 30% they had ownership of the Sawara 1 project. And it was pretty clear from some political leaders in the country that were concerned about this issue that a lot of the decisions had been made behind closed doors around this deal with Nautilus Minerals. So there was a lack of accountability and transparency about how this deal even got up. And then when the environmental impact statement came out, which was actually our first report, was really looking at that and what was missing. And it was quite fraught and missing a lot of information and documents that should have been made public for citizens in Papua New Guinea. So that was, I guess, in our end, the work we were doing in support of the communities was highlighting this lack of accountability and transparency, that the environmental impact statement was, just not good enough. And from there, I guess in terms of the movement on the ground, the communities would meet and eventually they formed what they call the Alliance of Sawara Warriors. Sawara in PNG meaning salt water. And that has been a force to be reckoned with in the context of Papua New Guinea around Nautilus Minerals and the Sawara 1 project. So along with the sort of work we've done regionally and sort of amplifying out what's going on the ground there, and also looking at the sort of finance of Nautilus, so a bit of a finance campaign. The Alliance of Sawara Warriors really mobilised across 6 provinces over the last 5 years to really build awareness on their local level with their church leaders, with local decision makers, all forms of civil society, to really build an effective movement that is calling for a ban on the industry in PNG. So for Nautilus, this meant they had no social license. And I guess this was quite key for the campaign. It's like, you can't operate here, there's no social license. And so we took the opportunity to then look at who the investors were and be able to build a campaign to make sure the investors understood that there was no social license, that communities were prepared to stand up. And in the history of Papua New Guinea, like in Bougainville, where a civil war resulted from Rio Tinto's Panguna mine because the communities didn't want it, a lot of these communities were saying, if you do this, the same will happen. So it was quite serious, very serious for them. So we sort of took that and reached out to investors. Now, the case of Nautilus is the two key investors were very hard for us to campaign around, because one is a Russian oligarch and the other one is an Omanian billionaire. So we needed to look at who was in there in terms of a company, and the company that we saw is Anglo-American. And they had, at the time, a 5% stake, which seems small, but it's enough for a company to be really impacted if they choose to divest. So around 2017, we wrote to them, and a couple of weeks later, I happened to be in the UK, so their head office is in London, and I met with them with our colleague Andrew Whitmore from London Mining Network, who is now the finance campaigner with us. So we met with Anglo-American and we sat with them and we talked about the clear case of environmental issues that were going to happen, and also that there was no social license, and did they really want to have such a risky investment? For them, they'd actually seen it as a bit of a research and development investment. So it was a small portfolio in the case of a very big corporation like that. And so for the following year after that meeting, we just kept informing them about the campaign on the ground and any other key information we felt was important for them to understand that this was not really a risky investment for them and that they should consider divesting. And by early 2018, they contacted us and said, we're going to be divesting from Nautilus. So this really opened up the floodgates of Nautilus spiraling, I guess, financially. There was also issues around technology. So they had built these 3 massive mining machines that were sitting just outside Port Moresby for tests. The tests were done in these shallow kind of dam type things they created. And to be honest, with some support from local communities that were able to navigate and actually get in and see some of the machinery, who were from that local area. So there were concerns from the local landowners of that area about these machines being even tested there. It was clear that they were starting to get rusty, that these machines weren't going to work. So we knew that they were having issues with the technology, and they were definitely having issues financially. And on top of that, the lack of social license really meant Nautilus was drowning, you know, and eventually that is what happened. So by 2019, they were liquidating and I guess effectively were bankrupt. Unfortunately, what happened though is it left Papua New Guinea in debt of about $100 million, which is a lot of money in Papua New Guinea, in a country that is desperate for funds to go into health and education and in infrastructure and roads and things like this. So for Papua New Guineans, this was, you know, a really huge loss and a sense an embarrassment for the government that this had happened. And there was no real legal recourse, although the government did look at it, to try and get that money back. So it really had been not a great thing for the PNG government to go into. So the case now is that you have all these licenses still sitting in the Bismarck Sea. And the community is actually currently right now, Jonathan Messelim, who is one of the key coordinators of the Alliance Sawara Warriors, who is from a village that is about 25 kilometres from the proposed Sawara 1 project. He and John Mamori from Caritas, Papua New Guinea, have been travelling around to all the different provinces to meet with all the Alliance of Sawara members, with churches, with decision makers, local decision makers, to engage and talk about where do we go now. And so they've officially said to me in the last day that while we call for a ban, our main message now is these licenses have to be cancelled. And so if that's what they're looking at nationally, is to push for the cancellation of these licenses in a step towards banning deep sea mining in PNG waters, although they also stand with the regional Pacific stance from the Pacific Blue Line Collective for a ban, not just in the EEZs, but also in international waters worldwide. And that has been a very big call from Reverend James Bhagwan, who heads up the Pacific Conference of Churches in the Pacific, which represent millions of people across that region. So there's a very strong movement really saying this can't go ahead. So, you know, a no to deep sea mining.